Well, welcome to the Impactus podcast. I'm Dean Brenton, and we are here to equip you as men for a life of purpose and godly impact. Have you ever felt stressed, burdened, overwhelmed by all the things that you have to do? And then comes along the church and our relationship with God, and we look at all the things we should be doing, and we see even more deficits and feel even more guilt. Christians are called to live a life that glorifies God and blesses others, but how do we do that when we're stretched to capacity? Well, what if God didn't expect you to do everything and certainly not do it all overnight? What if one of the greatest things we could do for God and our families, our communities, was just to show up? We tend to think it's the big, bold moments that matter, but in reality, it's the steady accumulation of small acts of obedience to God that add up to a life of meaning and impact. Well, I'm delighted today to have Drew Dyck with us. Drew is the editor at Moody Publishers. He's the former managing editor of Leadership Journal. He's an author of several books, including Your Future Self Will Thank You, The Bible and Brain Science, and his latest, Just Show Up. And we're going to talk about that today. Drew's work has been featured in Christianity Today, Relevant, and at CNN.com. He lives with his wife, Grace, and their 3 children near Portland, Oregon. As you'll hear, he's a fellow Canadian transplanted in the U.S., but we'll have him back at any time. You know, guys, it is a privilege to be able to bring you solid biblical and practical content through these podcasts. And if you know of a young guy who could use this kind of resource, invite them to check out our Young Men's podcast as well. And we'd be really grateful if you would subscribe and share our podcast and leave us a review on the platform you use, not for us, but to get more people to experience this content. And if you would like to support the work of the ministry of Impactus and these podcasts in particular, please head over to impactus.org/give and consider becoming a monthly impact partner or making a one-time donation to help us continue this vision to see every man become, grow, and live as a disciple of Jesus. Now let's get into today's episode. Well, welcome to the Impactus podcast. Drew, it is so good to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited about this.
Oh, it's going to be great. It's going to be a great conversation. So right off the bat, I discovered something in your background as I dug into your book that needs to be confessed today, but I understand you're from Canada.
That's right. I like to get that out of the way right off the right off the bat. Yeah, I grew up in, Red Deer, Alberta. Actually, before that, when I was a really little kid, I was in Fort McMurray, which is like,
Wow,
near the North Pole up there. And my dad was a Christian Missionary Alliance pastor up there. And but now I've been in the States for 22 years and I've lost all my Canadian cred, I feel like. So when I go back home and hang out with my buddies and my family, they're like, you sound like a Southern politician. And so I'm afraid I've lost my Canadian accent.
Well, we may have to remedy that by getting you back here for some more Canadian content or something.
Perfect. I'm sure it'll come back.
Tell us a little bit about the work you do currently. Obviously, you're an author. We're going to talk about your new book, Just Show Up, but tell us a little bit more about your ministry experience.
Yeah, so I have a few irons in the fire. I went to seminary and had these kind of vague aspirations to be a writer. I didn't know what that would look like. Stumbled into being an editor, did that for magazines for years, worked at Christianity Today for 8 years. These days I edit books for Moody Publishers. And so, and it's funny, and then of course I'm burning the publishing candle on both ends because I write books and I edit books. But I just think back to my own spiritual journey. And I think of how books were so crucial at certain formative stages. And so I still believe that God is in the business of changing people through the medium of the written word. And so I feel honored to be able to get up every day. I work in my pajamas at home, so that's pretty cool, except when I'm traveling. But to get up every day and be able to, create resources, hopefully, that draw people closer to God and communicate his truth. So, yeah, that's pretty cool.
Well, your latest book is called Just Show Up. So what was the inspiration for that book?
Yeah, man, it's a little embarrassing. It might have been a bit of a midlife crisis because I was thinking back to the time when I was in seminary and my wife, Grace, and we were very, idealistic. And we had these big, grandiose plans about what we were going to do for God, right? Do something really world changing. And I remember talking to her and saying, I don't want the American dream. Okay. I don't want the house in the suburbs and the 2.5 children and the white picket fence. We're going to do something different. And she was right there with me. And here I am, 17, 18 years later. And yeah, I live in the suburbs. I got a minivan. I don't have 2.5 children. I have 3. And then the question becomes, and I'm not complaining, my life is great, but the question becomes, okay, God, how do I serve you? When your life turned out a little more ordinary than radical, what does faithfulness look like? And that's the conclusion I came to. It's like, you know what? I don't think God calls us to change the world. He can do that, don't get me wrong, through our kind of ordinary faithfulness. But I think that he just calls us to small acts of faithfulness, to show up for the next thing in front of you. And that's honestly, just for me, it's been such a relief to kind of adopt that mentality, because it's like, I don't have to think kind of about the macro problems in the world and doing all these amazing things. I can just go, okay, Drew, even when you're tired, even when you're discouraged, just show up for the next thing in front of you, for the people that God's placed in your life. And that's been very freeing.
Now, I got a bit of a youth ministry background. So, we would sing the big anthems, right? History maker, being world changers and all those things. So that's a little bit of a twist here to say doesn't call us to be necessarily change our world, but unpack that a little more. Like, what kind of daily faithfulness kind of practices or things are you speaking about here?
Yeah, and it is a shift, and it's interesting because I grew up, I think, in a similar sort of environment where the certain subculture of evangelical church land, and I think it was well intentioned, but it's this like, okay, you got to be maybe a voice to the nations, or you got to do something really dramatic, and that can be a little disillusioning when it doesn't happen, and you think, well, did I miss the memo? What happened here? Like, did I sin one too many times and God kind of disqualified me?
Yeah.
And so I think that, again, God can use what we do through our faithfulness to change the world, but ultimately that's God's job. So I think just to kind of get that off of our shoulders and go, God, I'm going to be faithful. You do what you want through it, however broad or narrow that is. But I think the irony is that sometimes we can get so focused on those big picture things that we miss the opportunities that God places right in front of us, right?
Yeah.
And so, when I talk about ordinary faithfulness, man, I'm talking about, how can I show up, for my kids? This is something that's always a challenge for me because, I got 3 kids, but I'm always on my phone, especially if I'm kind of bored and I want to check out. And, I remember one time my son grabbed my phone, pulled it down, and I snapped at him like, hey, don't do that, And he kind of hung his head and he said, Dad, I just wanted your attention. And I was like, oh man. So just being present for my children, of course, for my wife, and then just for the people around me, my neighbors, my community, my church. And so I think, ultimately it's funny, God may use our life to impact thousands or millions of people, but often your greatest impact is going to come through being present, attentive, and serving the people right in front of you. I really believe that. And even if you do end up having a broader influence, it's often going to come through investing in a small number of people. I think of Jesus, right? He spoke to the multitudes, but most of his time was hanging out with 12 dudes, right? So,
absolutely.
And that's the same for us.
No, it's true though, and I was caught up in that same subculture, right? Like, we're going to change the world, we're going to be history makers, and all those things. And you can sometimes be so looking down the road or out there, you miss the things that are right in front of, and the people and relationships that are right in front of you. So that's a really profound thought, and great for all the dads and potential dads and out there, just to be reminded of those things. Now, you referenced a really cool story in the book about plotting. Tell us about what plotting is and why it's important.
Isn't that the sexiest topic? Plotting.
It's cool.
Yeah, maybe not sexy, but important. Yeah. And so, and what kind of put that on my radar was the story of William Carey, the father of modern missions. Talk about a guy who changed the world. But I love that quote from him, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't have it in front of me, but it basically says, I don't have any great talent, but I can plot. And you think of what he accomplished through that plotting approach to life. I mean, he opened all these orphanages and he brought the gospel to India and did all these amazing things. But if you could zoom in on any one given day of his life, you'd see a plotter, some guy who's just kind of getting up and doing the next thing in front of him. And so that's really encouraging to me. And I think especially right now in the time in which we live, where you jump on social media, you look on Instagram, you see people blowing up overnight and seeming to have this huge impact. And sometimes it's an illusion, or at the very least, you're looking at their highlight reels and comparing it to your everyday life. And it's pretty discouraging. But I think it's just encouraging to go, no, you know what? The best approach to life, especially when it comes to the life of faith, is the plotting approach. Just that quiet faithfulness every day. And the cool thing is that adds up over time, right?
Yeah.
Because the people who ultimately do have an impact on the people around them and really have a really cool influence for God are those steady people. If you think back to the people who influenced you in your life, often it's that person. It's not the star or the famous person who kind of, you read their book even, or, read a story about them, but it's that, older mentor who came alongside you, or that teacher, or that pastor, or that friend. So that's encouraging to me.
Yeah. My mind went back to some scriptures that just have been kind of popping for me in recent months, just words like patient endurance and perseverance and long suffering, the words that are not so popular, but they're so key, right? That long-term approach. You reference in the book something called a long haul hero, and I think you're alluding to that kind of thing, but what is that?
Yeah, and this is something I stole from a writer. Pete Davis was his name, and he talks about, first of all, he talks about infinite browsing mode. And what he means by that is, how you go on Netflix or whatever streaming service, and you don't want to commit to any one show. So you sit there for like an hour, maybe this is just me, you sit there for an hour or two with your spouse going, what should we watch? And you just scroll because you don't want to commit and, get nailed down to one particular show. And he compares that to how many of us approach life. We kind of use this infinite browsing mode where we got all these options and we're kind of overwhelmed by them, and we don't want to shut the door on things. And so we never really fully commit, or we just dabble, or we try things, and we just keep moving on, endlessly keeping our options open. He contrasts that with what he calls long haul heroes. And I love that. He talks about like his, piano teacher who taught piano for 28 years in the same town on the same street, or Mr. Rogers, doing all those episodes over all those years. And it's the long haul heroes who ultimately, like I was saying, have the greatest impact on us, and who are ultimately, living lives of faithfulness. And so I think that's just a better sort of model to aspire to, instead of trying to keep your options endlessly open, going, I'm going to invest in this town, in this community, in this group of friends, in this church, put down roots and really make an impact. Ultimately in the long term, that's what does.
Yeah. You also referenced something called finding God's will with your feet, and I think it has a similar connotation. What were you referencing there, and what does that mean?
Yeah, that was a title of one of the chapters, and people probably go, "What? How do you do that?" And yeah, all I meant there was, and again, going back to childhood, and it sounds like I'm ripping on my childhood. I'm not. I love the church, and it was a privilege to grow up in it. But sometimes the things that I heard about finding God's will weren't particularly helpful. Right? Where it's like, okay, maybe you kind of have to like wait for a sign, or try to solve a riddle, or, flip your Bible open to a random passage and hope that it tells you what to do. I've done it. And listen, God can miraculously guide you. But when it comes to finding God's will for your life, which isn't just a question for 20-year-olds, I find even in my stage of life, you're kind of going, okay, what's next?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of trying to solve a riddle, just being faithful. And I talk about, everyone has a common calling and a particular calling as Christians. Our common calling, love the Lord your God and your neighbor, right? Every Christian's called to do those things. And then your particular calling, that is what you're supposed to do, where you're supposed to live, if you're supposed to get married, all that kind of stuff. That's the part we obsess about, I feel like, the particular calling. But here's the thing. I think if you live out your common calling well, that is, you're being obedient to God, and you're showing up for the people around you, and you're just doing that next thing that you feel God is kind of nudging you towards, it has a way of making your particular calling crystal clear. And so that's what I mean by finding God's will with your feet. Just start moving. Take that next little step.
Yeah.
And then as you do, all of a sudden God's lighting the path ahead of you, and it becomes clear. And it's just far more, it's less paralyzing than sitting there and going, oh man, I don't want to miss the boat. God, I need a sign. Hey, just start moving. Let him guide you.
Yeah. You alluded to this a little earlier in the conversation, but we obviously have a lot of dads and granddads and potential dads at some point who follow what we do in this ministry. But you talk about the importance of being physically present with people, and I think it's just a profound thought especially for dads and the next generation. So unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah. Oh man, this is so important, especially for dads, because, and I talk about this in the book too, but I had conversations with two friends of mine about their fathers. It was really interesting. And it was like, in close proximity to each other, these conversations. The first friend talked about his dad, who was kind of in and out of his life growing up, more out than in actually. But then when he was, I think, a teenager, his dad discovers Jesus, becomes a Christian. Hey, praise God. But then he really only kind of comes around once in a while still, usually to preach at his son and kind of lecture him about the things he's doing wrong. My other friend talked about his dad, and he said, my dad is an interesting guy. He never said that I love you. And I thought that was weird. That's not good. He said he'd sit through a whole dinner and never even say a word, just really quiet. And I was like, man, that is so weird. Was he mad? And my friend's like, no, not at all. He's like, but I'll tell you what my dad did do. I would wake up in the morning before school and I could see him sitting in his chair with his Bible splayed open on his lap. He was at every single game. He loved my mother. He modeled what it was to love. He didn't work too much because he wanted to be there for us. And okay, so I'm looking at these two dads. Which is the better dad, right? And of course, the second dad, he should have said, I love you more. He should have been more verbally affirming. Kids need that, okay? Neither one is perfect. But man, if I'm going to choose which is the better dad, it's that second dad by a mile. Why? He wasn't perfect, but he was present. He was there. And I think people don't realize, it's funny. You see commercials on TV and you see that dad who's like the perfect dad. He's rolling on the floor, playing with his kids, doing everything right. And that's great. But sometimes dads are like, man, I come home from work, I'm a little bit grumpy. I have a hard time engaging. I don't think they realize the kind of baseline of psychological stability you're providing for your children just by being there, right? And we can always aspire to do better. Like I was saying, I need to put my phone down more. I need to, engage them, more, get down on their level and do that kind of stuff. That's important. But man, just being there, don't underestimate how crucial it is that you are that pillar in their life that they can count on. You're providing for them. You're in the home. That is huge.
Yeah, for sure. It makes me think one of the biggest distractions, of course, in our world, this thing, what would you say to young dads or dads that want to model that, but, the temptation, the pull of technology and Netflix and everything else, they can be in the room, but not in the room.
Yeah.
What would you say to those guys?
Well, first of all, I'd say I'm in the same camp and trying to figure this out myself. It's hard. Because tech crowds into every area of our life these days,
True.
Right? And it just feels like, if I leave the house and I accidentally forget my phone, it's like an existential crisis. I'm in line at the grocery store and I don't have a phone to look at. Like, what's going on? And they can be. I heard someone define, now quality time as a family is when you're all looking at the same screen. It's kind of sad, but there's some truth in that. So anyway, all to say the challenges are great, and of course, there's also one of the biggest struggles we have is getting our kids off of screens. But and this is a bit of a head trip, but it's true. Modeling, appropriate relationship to technology is going to be the most important thing for your kids, because you can tell them, hey, get off those screens, stop it. You've watched too much TV, put down that video game, whatever. But more often than not, they're going to emulate what you do rather than say what you do, what to do. So, one thing that our family's done, this is just a small thing and we've done it imperfectly, is have a no screen Sunday, right? Which is just what it sounds like. If you just have one day, out of 7, and it's not because, it's a Sabbath or something. It's just sort of like, okay, one day where we can drop our screens, we're not watching TV, and we don't do it all the time. And I'm usually the person who breaks it most often. But when we do, man, that's a little slice of heaven. You're looking each other in the eyes. You're having that engagement. And that is so crucial. You don't want your kids to grow up with the mental picture of you in their minds being of you with a phone in front of your face. So it is important, but the struggle is real, as they say.
Yeah, it's something we all face for sure. And those little moments to model those things, I think, can be so powerful. You describe yourself in the book, I think, as an escape artist. What did you mean by that?
This goes back to the phones. Yeah, I think during the pandemic, this hit me where I started looking at apps like Redfin or Zillow. I don't know what the Canadian equivalent is, but basically they're real estate apps where you can look at houses for sale. And we were kind of flirting with the idea of moving, but I was just kind of looking at these houses, and I had been pretty satisfied with our house. It's a fine house. It's got enough bedrooms for all of us and a garage and whatever. But then all of a sudden I'm looking at these houses and I'm like, man, our house stinks. Like, it doesn't have a sauna. It doesn't have a library. It doesn't have a pool. So I started getting a little discontent, and I started daydreaming about, oh man, could we swing it if we did this and that? Maybe we could get this larger house. And it was funny. It was my wife who finally kind of broke the reverie as she was looking over my shoulder one day, and she's like, we're never going to afford a house like that. And I said, well, not with that attitude, we're not. But she was right. And more than the kind of creeping materialism. The problem was I was using it as an escape hatch. Like when I was bored, and because we were stuck inside and life was really stressful during that time, and I just kind of check out by jumping on this app. And I started to realize that that wasn't a good habit, aside from the, being discontent with my house. And I think a lot of us do that. And maybe it's like, you're playing video games till 3 a.m, or you're spending all day on social media, frittering away hours of your time. But often I think that's a signal that you need to kind of do some personal inventory and go, hey, what kind of desires are not being filled here? Like, am I going to God to slake my spiritual thirst? Because if you're not, sometimes it comes out in weird ways and you start engaging in that escapist behavior. And so it's crucial to make sure you're feeding your soul and being honest with yourself. Like, hey, do I really need to spend 3 hours on this website every day? Do I really need to do this? It's good to have hobbies, but sometimes we're checking out and we're escaping.
Yeah. And every time we do that, we miss the opportunities to show up again, as you talk about.
Exactly.
You've got really vulnerable in the book and shared some of your own journey around anxiety and some of the challenges that you face with mental wellness. And how does just showing up impact those kinds of realities for you and for others?
Yeah, no, that's right. It's funny. So yeah, I have an anxiety disorder. Sometimes it's better than others. And it started something that started in my 20s, and it's been a challenge like throughout the years. And the first thing I remember, I probably struggled with it for almost 10 years before I even started telling anyone about it. And this is how sick it would be. I'd be like, someone would be telling me like, hey, Drew, I'm having panic attacks and struggling with this stuff. And I'd be like, oh man, that sounds hard, man. I'll be praying for you, brother. And not even tell them that I was dealing with the same issue. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's part of being a dude, or you think, okay, I'm going to figure this out myself. Right. I don't need to tell anyone. I'll sort it myself. Man, that's a misstep when it comes to this, because especially when you're struggling with a mental illness issue, mental health issue, you need people. So yes, back to the theme of showing up. Physical presence is huge. Instead of isolating yourself, I've just found that's so important. And this is an instance in which you're not so much showing up for other people, but they're showing up for you, and you're letting them show up for you. A couple of years ago, I was at a particularly low point with my anxiety. I talk about this in the book too, but my wife actually informed my brother, who lives nearby me, what I was going through. He shoots me a text and he says, Drew, I'm picking you up in 15 minutes. And he comes to my house. I get in the car, and then he tells me his plan. He's like, we're going to go buy a bunch of jackets, middle of winter, and we're going to hand them out to people, homeless folks downtown. And so that's what we did. And it was good, thing to do. But I realized that the little mission had more to do with me, helping me than helping the homeless folks. And it was exactly what I needed, because I needed to get out of the house. I've been in the house too long. I needed to stop thinking about my problems, and think about some people who had bigger problems, frankly, than I did. And yet it would have never happened had my brother not actually physically showed up at my house and been physically present with me. So I think when we see that people are going through a hard time, it's easy to, you can maybe shoot a text or, leave a little broken heart emoji on their Facebook page or something, but nothing beats physical presence, especially when it comes to mental health issues.
Yeah, that's so good. Showing up. Yeah. And also just giving to someone else. There's nothing like that for helping your own health and wellness. And yeah, it's really good. One of the spiritual health pieces that we talk a lot around here about are, our devotional life, our spiritual disciplines and things like that. What does that have to do with showing up?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when it comes to spiritual disciplines, that's a way of showing up for your relationship with God, showing up to commune with God. And what I try to do, and this sounds a little counterintuitive, maybe some people have kind of reacted to this and go, well, that doesn't sound right, Drew. But I almost want to lower the bar. So I'll explain what I mean by that. And sometimes when we have this, it seems to happen around January, because you're trying to get some new practices for a new year. And you go, I'm going to read through the Bible this year. I'm going to spend an hour a day in prayer, or something like, just, you got these big plans for your spiritual disciplines. And it comes from a good place, because you want to get serious about your faith. But you know how this goes, right? It's like maybe you do it for a day or two, maybe for a week, and then all of a sudden you fall off the wagon, and then your Bible's gathering dust in the corner of your room and you're not even opening it. So my advice is like, lower the bar. Just like one thing I tell myself, Drew, just crack your Bible open every day. That's it. That's it. Even if you read one verse or a psalm or something really short, hey, that's great, because if you're doing that every day, that's 365 times you're opening your Bible. and engaging God's word. And the way it works, sometimes maybe you're really busy, and so you just open it up, you read a verse or two, and then you move on with your day. But sometimes you slip into a groove and you might read a couple chapters. And the important thing is that you're instituting this kind of rhythm in your life of engaging with God's word. And same for other things, for prayer, for service, for all these other things. But I think sometimes people think like, oh, I have to fast for a week, or I have to master a spiritual discipline with a Latin name, or, all these kind of things. And man, no, just show up every day. Just be consistent, even if it's small, because that adds up, and it shapes, just like exercise. If you do it consistently, it starts to change you. It starts to shape your life, and strengthen your spiritual muscles, and ultimately your connection to God.
Well, one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is just it's like a pressure relief valve. Like you've taken the pressure off of our lives through what you wrote. Say you don't have to do all those things. And I like that analogy of lowering the bar, because if we don't lower the bar, we'll never be able to raise the bar. And sometimes we want to shoot for, I'm going to read the Bible through in a year, and we can't get off the first page. And so those kind of principles are, I think, really helpful and freeing for life and for spirituality. Now, you also say it's important sometimes to let some things slide. Now, that seems a little counterintuitive. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's along the same vein. By the way, where I always stall out in my Bible reading plan is Leviticus. I don't know. I just, oh man. Anyway, but yeah, so letting something slide. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to show up for the important things in your life, for the people God's placed in your life, for the calling God's placed on your life, then that means you can't show up for everything. This is just kind of a, acknowledgement of how finite we are, how limited our time and energy is. And so then you have to kind of take a serious, clear-eyed look at your life and go, what is it that I can drop? And the kind of silly thing I mentioned in the book, actually, I'm looking at it right now, is my yard. I had illusions that I was going to have this perfect yard. And I was like, okay, maybe I need to resod it or put down seed or whatever. And all of a sudden I realized, man, I got kids playing in there, digging in there all the time. I am really busy at this time of life, with my career, with my family. I think I've got to let that slide. I don't think I'm going to have a perfect yard. Maybe in like, 10 years or something when the kids are gone. But right now I've got bigger fish to fry. And so that, if you can kind of look at some things and go, I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do it well, frankly, that can actually take a lot of pressure off. Now, the question becomes, how do you determine what you're going to let slide? That's the harder question, I think, right? Because it's not about like, most Christians aren't sitting around like, should I have an affair and blow up my marriage? Or should I, get into drugs? Well, those things are bad. Hopefully you fend off that temptation, but it's usually about discerning the best from among the merely good. And so one thing, obviously, as you're looking at your life and you're thinking of what commitment can I drop? You don't want to, drop your commitment to your family or your job or things that you need to do. But if you can look at some of these things and go, wow, if I dropped this, would my primary emotion be sadness or relief? And if it's relief, sometimes, at least in my experience, that's been a good indication that maybe I need to offload that. And then, of course, like for me, I asked my wife, and she knows me super well and yet has some objectivity. She can go, you know what? Why are you doing this? You need to drop that. And here's the good news. People are more understanding than you think. There's actually studies about this. People dread, especially if you're a people pleaser, like, I can't tell them that this year I can't chair this committee or whatever it is. And yet if you explain it and say, hey, I would love to, unfortunately, I'm busy in this season because of these reasons and I can't do it. Most of the time people go, yeah, I get it. I'm busy too. And they cut you some slack.
Yeah, that's good advice. For the guy who's watching today or listening, and all the talk about faith, maybe their faith is really struggling, or they've been hurt by the church, or deconstructing, or just really not healthy, in a healthy place right now. What would you say to someone whose faith is wavering and they're in that kind of struggle right now?
Yeah, man, there's no easy answer for that. But the one thing I'd say is to hang on. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And, I've seen my first book, actually, I wrote about young people leaving the faith. And so I tracked down a bunch of 20-somethings and just asked them about their experience. And, it's interesting because I've seen people that have been plagued by doubt, people that have had awful experiences in the church or felt betrayed by Christian friends, and they've left the faith. I've seen people have those identical experiences and somehow not only retain their faith, but actually have it drive them closer to God.
Mm.
And the main difference between the two is one stopped talking to God and one kept talking to God. That is, and the beautiful thing about our faith is, especially when you open the scriptures, you see this repeatedly. You are allowed to express your doubts. You are allowed to bring them to God. You're even allowed to accuse God of indifference. And you read like Job and some of the Psalms, the imprecatory Psalms, right? Where it's like, Lord, where are you? Have you forgotten me? What's going on? And so my advice is keep talking to God. Keep that relationship open. Like, marriage counselors will tell you that a marriage is not most in trouble when they're fighting. A marriage is most in trouble when they stop talking, right?
Mm-hmm.
When that kind of anger hardens into apathy and they disengage. And I think it's similar in our relationship with God. Don't go silent. Keep talking to God. Keep bringing your doubts and your frustrations. And I love the story of Jacob in the Bible for this reason, right? He hangs on to God. He has that wrestling match with God where he sees God's face and he wrestles with that man until dawn. And then he says, wow, I've struggled with God and lived. And Jacob had so many shortcomings. He was a scoundrel, to put it frankly. And yet he knew that he needed God and he hung on. And so that's a good model for me anyway, because I've been through those periods myself where I'm doubting and I'm discouraged. And don't give up. Keep hanging on to God. You're in good company with many of the biblical writers as well.
Yeah. That's really great advice, Drew. It's so simple. Sometimes I think we can miss it, right? Just keep showing up, keep plodding on, keep hanging on, and doing the things that we know we need to keep doing. And God has a way of working through that. And but it is sometimes the temptation is just to back off too quickly or give up too easily. And I love the idea, and I think it'll resonate for a lot of guys. Just keep showing up. Just keep showing up. What is your ultimate hope for the book, and where do you want it to land in terms of the impact that you'd like to see it have?
Yeah, I hope it encourages people. And like you said, I hope it kind of is a bit of a relief, to some of the expectations maybe that they or others place on them. And here's the thing. I've talked to a lot of people who are discouraged, like especially in this season. I feel like everyone's tired and discouraged. And a lot of people too who feel like they God put them on the shelf, maybe, right? Who they thought like, man, God, I thought my life was going to go differently. I thought I was going to have this impact. I thought I was going to have this influence. And it hasn't panned out that way for whatever reason. And an example I talk a lot about in the book is Moses, right? Here's this guy, he's going to be this liberator of his people. And then he finds himself, bang, he's in the wilderness for 40 years tending sheep. And I'm sure he had some questions when he was in that phase. But what I love about that story is that, Moses didn't have to solve any riddles to find God's will. He just kept tending the sheep, doing what was in front of him. And in the midst of doing that, God shows up in the burning bush and directs him. And so I like to encourage people, like, even if you're in a hard or discouraging season like that, keep doing what you're doing because God's going to use it. God was working on Moses, I think, in those years. He was humbling him. He was leading. He was teaching him how to lead. He was teaching him patience and all those things that would be instrumental in him leading the Israelites. And if you're in a hard or discouraging season right now, it may be that he's doing something through your faithfulness right now, but he's also probably preparing you for things in ways you can't even anticipate yet. And you're going to look back and see how instrumental that was. So don't give up. Like you said, it's easy to withdraw and just kind of go out. That's it. I've had it. Keep taking that next step in front of you. Keep being faithful. God is doing something with it.
That's a great place to kind of wind down the conversation today. I think that's a great encouragement for dads, for young guys, for granddads, for ministry leaders, for pastors. You're so right. Like this is a difficult season. It's a weary season and it's easy to give up, but I love what God has laid on your heart to share with us and through the book to keep showing up, because I think there's something profound that can happen there. Are you okay to do a little speed round before we finish?
Man. Let's do it. I'm nervous, but I'm going to try to stay loose here. And yeah.
Okay. Well, with no prep and no prior warning, here we go. The thing you most miss about Canada?
Oh man, that's easy. No, okay. I got to say the people.
Family, maybe?
Family, my two brothers that still live there. Yes, my buddies, absolutely. But after that, ketchup chips. Ketchup chips, man. You can't get them down here.
It's true.
No, and so my sister-in-law came from Canada recently, and she brought like a whole suitcase of Canadian candy. And man, I just like dove in head first. It was for the kids, but I took down a lot of it myself. And I suffer for this too, because a lot of people, Americans, don't like ketchup chips, and I try to get them to taste them and see how good they are, and they go, gross, ketchup chips. What kind of nonsense is that? But yes, ketchup chips.
Classic Canadian right
Classic.
there. That is amazing. Favorite coffee. And your cup may have given it away today, but
yeah. Okay, so here's the problem. And this is a real shameful thing, because I live in the Northwest near Portland, Oregon, which is like coffee capital. And here I am. Yeah, if they're watching the video, they can see I'm holding up a Starbucks, which is not looked favorably on around here, because that's kind of selling out. But I'm not a snob about coffee. I do drink coffee. We even have a Keurig, and I'm like, that's good enough for me. So I wish I could say I was a snob and be like, oh yeah, I have to go to Heart Coffee, or I only like this medium roast or something like that. But I just need the caffeine delivery system.
It was a little bit of a trick question, because I was thinking you might go with Tim Hortons.
Timmy's,
but...
right. Well, you know what's funny? We had a book launch party a few weeks ago, and my wife ordered Tim Hortons coffee for it.
Awesome.
Just to keep it Canadian.
Yep. Got to keep it Canadian. That's good. What's your favorite way to recharge your own personal batteries?
Oh man, that is great. You know what? It's a little cliche, but just going for a walk, especially if we can ditch the kids for a little bit and just go with my wife on grab a coffee. We live in such a beautiful area of this country, hitting the trails and just kind of walking. And that does, just being in nature, right?
Yeah.
Recharges my batteries. And man, I need it these days, because life is busy.
Yeah, we all need that. The most impactful book you read in the past year?
Ooh, wow. Oh man. Now this is going to be the toughest one. Wow.
That's a real test.
Yes. And I'm like scanning the books on my desk right now. And I know I can't say my own, because that's oh man, let me think. Well, maybe this was a little more than a year ago, and I don't know if it'd be the most impactful, but I do recommend everyone reads it. The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you've heard of that one. Yeah. It's just really interesting, especially as a father, as I'm thinking about the next generation of my kids specifically. He just makes the point that we've kind of nerfed the world for these kids, and we, watch them constantly, and the drawbacks to that, because we think we're obsessed with safety, but there are drawbacks to that. So we got a whole generation growing up, and they've never had to like hash things out without adult supervision between them. And anyway, so fascinating book. Highly recommend it.
Great choice. Last question. If you could meet one Bible character for coffee, not Jesus.
Yes, I was going to say.
Would it be?
My goodness. Oh, these are such good questions. I think I'd go on Apostle Paul.
Okay.
Just because what a fascinating individual. Like Paul's personality just leaps off the pages of Scripture. He's so intense. Yeah. And yet, and of course he gets this bad rap for being like, patriarchal and stuff, which I don't think he is. But he was also a mystic, and had these like incredible spiritual experiences and stuff. And so he's just full of these seeming contradictions. And of course he's an absolute genius. Like, Paul's IQ probably would have been like 160, I swear. The guy is just wild that way. And so what a fascinating individual to talk to. So I'm going to hunt him down when I get to Glory for a conversation.
Good choice. I'm not sure if he'd be a Timmy's guy or a Starbucks guy, but it'd be a great conversation for sure. Drew, where can people follow you and get a copy of Just Show Up?
Yeah. So, well, as far as the book, there's a little book selling website called Amazon.ca in Canada.
That's right. Good.
That's right. I got the CA. Just about anywhere I think you can pick up a copy. And then, as far as connecting with me, I have a website, just my name, Drew Dyck, DYCK.com. And you can read a free chapter from the book there and see some cheesy pictures of my family and me, and shoot me an email if you want. Or, hey, if you're down, south of the border and you want to hang out, I am in the Northwest, and you could just show up and we'll grab a coffee, not Timmy's, but we'll grab a coffee, and I'll show you the greatest bookstore in the world, which is Powell's in Portland. Yeah, that's how you can connect with me.
May have to take you up on that one day.
Absolutely.
That'd be great. Drew, thanks so much for being with us on the podcast. This has been a real fun conversation, especially with a fellow Canadian.
There you go.
We'll take you back anytime, and it'd be great. But no, thanks so much for sharing your heart, your life, your work through the book. And I can't recommend it highly enough. Like, guys, get your hands on a copy of Just Show Up. It'll be revolutionary. So please do that. So thanks again, Drew.
Hey, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Impactus podcast. To learn more about living a life of purpose and godly impact, check out impactus.org.